Hi everyone, we're just going to begin in about 15 seconds, so just please take your seat and we're going to kick off with the first parallel session of the day, which is plant-based. We're going to be discussing optimizing nutrition for the entire family. So do make your way to a chair. Perfect. So, hi everyone. For those of you who haven't met me before, my name is Rohini, and I'm the communications lead at Plant-Based Health Professionals UK and a nutritionist. And it gives me great pleasure to be chairing this first session on optimizing nutrition for the entire family. And I'll be presenting first on nutrition essentials for adults, and then we'll be handing over to the other panelists. The second person speaking is Dr. Miriam Martinez-Biarge, who's a consultant pediatrician, and she's going to be discussing the latest studies on plant-based diets for children, which is such a hot topic right now. And then we're going to have Ailsa McHardy, who's a pediatric dietitian, and she's going to be discussing plant-based nutrition for children and ensuring nutrient adequacy at all stages of growth during infancy and childhood. So a pretty huge topic. And then we're going to be going to Q&A at the end. And please do make sure that you have downloaded the Slido app so that you can ask questions at any point, and then we'll be doing a panel Q&A at the very end of the session. So the code, if you haven't downloaded that already, the code is 8893517. That's 8893517. So do that, and then you can type in your questions for the panelists and for all of us at the end. Wonderful. So I already gave you a little intro to who I am. I have an MSc in nutrition and food science, and full disclosure, I've been personally vegan for around 15 years and have done lots of paid speaking and corporate engagements on plant-based nutrition as well, and run my own practice, as well as put out a lot of evidence-based information around plant-based diets in my role as communications lead at PBHP. And some of you will recognize me from doing the CPD accredited webinars every fortnight as well. So this is a pretty huge topic, understanding nutrient essentials for adults following a plant-based diet. And I'm really going to do a whistle-stop tour of these 9 nutrients of focus that really I think everyone who's following a plant-based diet should at least be aware of. And just to emphasize that none of this is individual nutrition advice. There will always be some nuances, some differences, depending on your age, gender, activity levels, allergies and tolerances, and particularly if you're living with a chronic disease. So this isn't totally comprehensive. In fact, I could do an entire talk on each one of these nutrients because there is so much to say on these and thousands of studies out there. So firstly, what do the experts say? We already heard in this morning's introduction from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics that, plant-based diets are safe, they're healthy at all stages of life. And the BDA in the UK, which is the biggest nutrition and dietetic organization, confirms that well-planned plant-based diets are suitable right from the moment of conception up to older age. And Brenda Davis, pretty much the most famous vegan dietitian in the world, will be discussing plant-based nutrition for older adults, so we are going to cover that topic as well. Now, well-planned kind of throws people off sometimes, but well-planned doesn't mean you need to become a nutritionist. I do think everyone who wants to have a healthy diet, plant-based or not, should understand the nutrient essentials so you can empower yourself, not just to be healthy now, but also take this lifestyle into the future and really thrive and reach your potential. And that's what nutrition to me is all about. Unhealthy diets are now the cause of 1 in 4 deaths globally, the leading cause of death, and almost a third of premature deaths gone far too soon in Europe. And this is really quite shocking. This was from the Global Burden of Disease study in The Lancet. And we know that unhealthy diets are typically too high in animal foods, in ultra-processed foods, and low in whole grains and fruits, and also too high in salt. And that's what the study showed. And they're insufficient in healthy plant foods. This lack of fiber can contribute to increased inflammation and higher risk of chronic diseases, which they're discussing in the other room, those cardiometabolic diseases, as well as several cancers. Now, there are several protective elements of a whole food plant-based diet. That's one that's based around whole grains, beans, fruits, vegetables, nuts and seeds, herbs and spices, and plenty of water as the drink of choice. And these include being rich in those 13 essential vitamins and 16 minerals that our body really needs, and there are plenty more as well. And most of these nutrients can be attained on a whole food plant-based diet. I'll be discussing one or two that are difficult to obtain. Lower in calories, so great for weight management. We know that almost 2/3 of UK adults are living with obesity or overweight, and it's still very nutrient dense. High in fiber, only 1 in 10 adults in the UK currently meets the RDA for fiber, which is 30 grams per day, which is pretty shocking stuff. And rich in antioxidants and polyphenols, especially getting all that color in from those fruits and vegetables. Free of dietary cholesterol, low in saturated fat, and low in advanced glycation end products, which are produced naturally in the body when protein and fat combines with sugar in the bloodstream. And that happens right from the stage of early embryonic development. But these harmful compounds have been linked to an increased risk of inflammation, chronic disease, and we can also obtain them from our food. They also enter the body through our diet. We know that whole plant foods like whole grains and beans and things like that are naturally low in AGEs, these harmful compounds. But animal foods, even boiled chicken, is really high. And we can also make some changes based on cooking methods as well. So adding things like lemon and vinegar to food, not using high temperature cooking methods like grilling and barbecuing, but doing more steaming and poaching, and eating some raw foods as well, choosing raw nuts over roasted nuts. Roasted nuts have almost 30 times the amount of AGEs. So this is just another element to be aware of. We're really excited to have updated our plant-based Eat Well guide at PBHP, which is a great visual guide for anyone who wants to share this with patients or have a look themselves. And we talk about how to balance your plate on a plant-based diet, as well as the nutrients of focus. It's very user-friendly, very patient-friendly. You can download it for free via our fact sheets on our website. But this is a great kind of adaptation of the NHS Eat Well guide, which we all know. So what do we want to eat when it comes to a plant-based diet for optimal health? Whole fruit rather than juice, which has the fiber removed. Lots of vegetables, aiming for at least 10 portions a day. But again, I always encourage people to tailor this depending on where their patient is at. And dark leafy greens being the most nutrient dense per calorie. Legumes like beans, lentils, peas, soya. 1 portion of soya is about 80 grams of tofu or 200 mils of soya milk, and they are fantastic to start from childhood, which we're going to hear a bit about later. Whole and minimally processed grains. If you have issues with blood sugar regulation or things like that, I would be more inclined to go for those intact whole grains, things like oat groats, barley, red rice, quinoa. And then starchy vegetables. A quick tip to reduce the glycemic load of these starchy vegetables is to cool them. So pop them in the fridge when they're still warm, and then when you take them out and eat them either cold or you can reheat them at that point, that increases the resistant starch, which and decreases the glycemic load. So it's a really great quick tip. Nuts and seeds and herbs and spices, particularly things like cinnamon, turmeric, ginger, all very anti-inflammatory. So B12, everyone hopefully in this room is supplementing with B12. It's made by microorganisms in the soil, not plants or animals. And a supplement is the safest, cheapest, most reliable source. The RDA is 2.4 micrograms a day, but we do suggest taking at least 25 micrograms to 50 micrograms a day. 50 micrograms minimum if you're over 65, that's in our Eat Well guide, or 2,000 micrograms weekly is recommended because we don't absorb as much when we just take it in one dose. And this helps prevent fatigue, folate deficiency, anemia, and nervous system damage. And it's really a really essential nutrient. It can be quite dangerous if you are not adequate in B12. Protein, we're going to have a great session about musculoskeletal health tomorrow and really dive into protein. But I would suggest, eating a variety of foods, particularly legumes, meeting calorie needs on a plant-based diet. And studies do suggest that in terms of protein balance, we want to get at least 1 kilogram per kilo of body weight if you're following a whole food plant-based diet. And you can aim for 1 to 1.6 grams per kilogram, particularly the higher end of that if you're older in age, or you're exercising a lot, particularly strength training and muscle building. And one of the simple tips is just to include a serving of plant protein with every meal. So you could have soya milk, you could add peanuts to a meal, you can add lots of lentils, tempeh, seitan. The ones at the top, the lentils, the beans, the peas, the soya, they're particularly rich in lysine. Other foods that are rich in lysine are pistachios and quinoa. So do bring those into the diet. And then there's protein found in lots of different plant foods in varying amounts, but all plants do have all 9 essential amino acids. So whole grains like oats contribute a decent amount, and then things like peanuts, cashews, flax, it all adds in. So just having that variety, but I would suggest having at least 3 servings of legumes a day and more if you're very active. Iron. Iron is the most common nutritional deficiency globally, affecting at least a third of the world's population. And it's really important to be aware of this, particularly if you're someone who's menstruating, because iron needs are higher at 11.8 milligrams per day. That's the RDA for that, and 8.7 milligrams if you do not menstruate. So you can see that the requirements are slightly higher. And one of the big causes of iron deficiency can be things like having heavy periods if you are menstruating. There are other sources of non-heme iron in plant-based. There are sources of plant-based non-heme iron that we want to get into our diet: tofu, lentils, beans, cashews, dates, kale, broccoli, those low oxalate greens. And yes, non-heme iron is less absorbable and less bioavailable than the heme iron found in things like red meat, but we know that really high levels of that can also increase our risk of things like type 2 diabetes, certain cancers, heart disease, so more doesn't necessarily equal better. And avoid having things like red wine, tea, and coffee with meals. I see this a lot with my patients. I see, they're having with a lot of my clients, they're having a lot of tea with their meals. So they'll be having a wonderful iron-rich breakfast, but then having a couple of cups of black tea with that. So we want to do away with that, particularly if iron is low. And pair vitamin C-rich foods with iron-rich foods to increase iron uptake. That's one of the best things you can do. So having a small amount of orange juice with, your breakfast, particularly for children who, you don't want to add, we'll talk about, I'll leave that to the experts actually. But, having lots of lemon on your lentils, adding broccoli and red peppers to a tofu stir fry, or blueberries to your oats, and soaking, fermenting, and sprouting can help aid the absorption of iron and nutrients like zinc as well. Calcium is one that's going to be covered later today in the EPIC Oxford study discussion, but we need at least 700 milligrams per day according to the UK RDA. Now that is slightly higher in the USA, and we want to certainly get that, and it's not that unachievable. And this is obviously key for strong bones and teeth and healthy muscle and nerve function. And getting 700 milligrams might sound like a lot, but it's only a quarter of a pack of a standard block of tofu, like cauldron tofu, and a cup, 250 ml of fortified soya milk or pea milk or oat milk. So that's really achievable, a quarter of a pack of tofu and a cup of soya milk. And you want to avoid calcium thieves, so high intakes of sodium, alcohol, and caffeine. So, 5 cups of coffee or more a day, that could inhibit that. And making sure that you're buying the fortified versions of plant milks and yogurts. And that is especially important when we're feeding children and older adults. And we know that from the studies that there's no negative impact on bone health if dairy is avoided. Obviously, dairy is a rich source of calcium, but we can get that from these sources. And there are lots of fantastic sources of calcium from low oxalate green veg. Bok choy is one of my favorite, also rocket leaves, kale, and things like dried fruit like figs and nuts like almonds. Vitamin D3 is a bit different because it's not actually a vitamin, it's hormone, it's a hormone, and it's synthesized by the action of sunlight on our skin, but it plays such a key role throughout the body in a variety of processes, including immune function, healthy bones, which I'd already just discussed, and reproductive system as well. So we want to make sure we're getting enough vitamin D, particularly if you've got darker skin like me, or you cover up when you go outside, you're housebound, maybe living with illness. And food sources are generally poor. Even things like oily fish and eggs and things, which are often touted as having lots of vitamin D, we're much better off taking a supplement. And the UK government does recommend everyone to take a supplement from September to early April. I would suggest anyone on a plant-based diet does take that supplement year-round, so at least 10 micrograms a day. That's too little for me. I take slightly more because of my darker skin. But if you don't want to take also mega high doses, and do check that with your GP or health professional, and you can also get your vitamin D levels tested. Zinc is another one that doesn't come up that much, but it is something to be really aware of, especially as men do have higher needs of zinc. And it's really important for immune function, for wound healing, for growth, particularly in children. And phytates in grains and beans can really reduce that zinc absorption. So again, you want to soak your lentils and beans. If you've got time, fermenting and sprouting can also help. And things like tempeh and mushrooms and nutritional yeast are all great sources of zinc as well. So there are lots of great food sources, and we don't just want to take mega high doses of zinc because it can in time lead to things like a copper deficiency. So supplements are not necessarily just safe. Just taking high doses of zinc isn't really required for many of us. And they haven't been shown to improve athletic performance either. So yeah, I just try to get those whole grains and all those other sources in. Omega-3 fats are super key for health, and they are essential fatty acids, which means we have to obtain them from the diet. We can't make them ourselves. And they play such important roles, particularly in cardiovascular health, brain health, joint health, reproductive health. And there are three main types. So the alpha-linoleic acid, which you see in abundance in those plant-based foods, particularly the ones I've mentioned there. So milled flaxseed, it does have to be milled so you can absorb those fantastic ALAs, and then chia seeds and 1/4 cup of walnut halves, or about 6 walnut halves, and choose at least one of those a day. And they're important in their own right because they're packed with fiber, with lignans, with lots of other fantastic benefits. So that's a great thing to add into your smoothies, salads, porridge. And those long chain omega-3s are also really key, the DHA and EPA, and we can get those from algae, which is the same source that fish get them from. And these long-chain amino acids, long-chain omega-3 fatty acids are really key. So do consider taking a DHA or EPA supplement with at least 500 milligrams of combined DHA and EPA. And that's really important at the extremes of life, so older age and in childhood, but also for people who are pregnant, who are breastfeeding or chest feeding, it's really important. But hopefully we're going to hear more about that during the course of this conference. Two micronutrients that some people have not heard of but play such an important role are iodine and selenium, and both are actually needed for optimal thyroid health. And inadequate iodine is actually the main cause of preventable brain damage worldwide, so we could actually really mitigate that. And it's needed in the preconception period, in pregnancy and breastfeeding. And you don't just want to go for any seaweed. Seaweeds can be too high in iodine, like kelp and hijiki. Some plant milks, like Oatly, which we have out here, does have added iodine, and it's good to see more out there. But I do take a supplement personally, 140 micrograms of a potassium iodide supplement. Selenium plays a really important role in protecting our cells from oxidative damage, but also helps with healthy skin, hair, nails. Who doesn't want that? So have a couple of Brazil nuts a day. You don't want to, again, overdo it, but 1 to 2 Brazil nuts will give you that RDA, which is 16 micrograms for women and 75 micrograms for men. And you can also get some from things like whole grain oats and sunflower seeds and brown rice as well. So that's the nutrients. So that's, it's a lot of information, I'm aware, and sometimes it's hard to know how do you actually stay on top of that when you've got a busy lifestyle, when you're at work, when you're traveling. And these are just some practical tips that I tell all my clients to kind of include. When you're eating out, be the group leader, be proactive in choosing a restaurant, ideally a plant-based one. You can use things like Happy Cow and TripAdvisor to check that they have plant-based options, and email, phone ahead, or write to them to check if they can cater for you. I know that seems like a bit of extra work, not everyone wants to do it, but it can be game-changing, especially when you're going abroad. And eat a protein-rich meal if you're going out to a restaurant where you know the plant-based options of diet. So you might be just getting some tomato sauce and spaghetti, and that's not really going to give you, everything. So having a nice tofu stir-fry for lunch, or having a protein-rich snack like a slice of whole wheat bread with peanut butter. Offer to bring a dish to friends' places, and take a pillbox with your supplements as well. If you're traveling and you're on the go, you might forget to take that B12 and those other things, so that can help. And there's great things like a vegan passport and packed lunch and snacks. Hopefully you don't need those today. So just to summarize, base a majority of your meals around whole plant foods. It doesn't need to be all of your meals or snacks. There is room for fun foods, celebration, enjoyment. Food is not just about nutrition, and I'm aware that I'm a nutritionist saying that, but there is a lot to be said for culture, for sharing with others, so do keep that in mind. And nutrition is also just one aspect of a healthy lifestyle. I'm a lifestyle medicine practitioner as well, so it's really important to, not just be myopic about nutrition, but look at things like movement, look at stress, look at sleep, look at your relationships. It's just so amazing to all be here today together as a community, and that has a profound role on our health as well. And intact whole grains. I'd love to see more of those, that more diversity. If you're always having the same brown rice, try red rice or wild rice, try quinoa, teff, barley. A lot of places discount those because not many people are buying them. And then unsaturated fats, avocados, nut seeds, extra virgin olive oil, if you like as well. Make water your drink of choice. Herbal teas and coffees and things are also fine. And make sure you're definitely supplementing with vitamin B12 and vitamin D3, but consider the other supplements or consider the other nutrients I mentioned. If there's one thing to take away from this talk, it's to focus on color. And this is, a great representation of the abundance, the color, the variety that you can get in a whole food plant-based diet, getting that diversity of plants to foster a healthy gut microbiome. A portion, whether you're a child or an adult, is generally what fits in the palm of your hand, so around 80 grams. Obviously, if you're taller and bigger, you're going to have bigger hands. So, just use that as a guide. You don't have to measure and track everything, but getting this color in is key. And you can enjoy your cultural foods. This is my South Asian plant-based plate, including a quinoa upma, which is a traditional South Indian breakfast dish. Instead of using semolina, which is a refined grain, I use quinoa, which is higher in protein and other micronutrients. Tofu palak, which is a spinach dish that's instead of using paneer, which is a cheese, using tofu. Having red rice, which is about 6 times higher in antioxidants and polyphenols than brown rice even, and higher in fiber than brown rice. And then a lovely fruit salad with a variety of different things, and things like chickpea dishes with all those herbs and spices. You can make food taste really good. And to end with this quote, it's not about what you're giving up, it's about all the things you're embracing. And I always try to remind my clients of that. There's so much focus on what you have to cut out, what you have to get rid of. Let's focus on what we can bring in to the diet. And lastly, some resources that I absolutely love and I share with everyone on plant-based diets. These are kind of classics that you need in your bookshelf. Obviously, full disclosure, one of those is a book that I've written, but it does have lots of recipes and shopping lists and things as well. But Plant Power Doctor by Dr. Gemma Newman is a great guide that's almost like a friend talking to you as you transition to a plant-based diet. Shireen Kassam, obviously, and her sister, Dr. Zara Kassam, the Eating Plant-Based, answers every question that I haven't been able to answer everything here. And this textbook, which we're selling books in the exhibitor section. And we've got loads of free fact sheets as well. Obviously, the Plant-Based Eat Well guide, and do follow us on social media and keep in touch. And I've included references there. Hopefully you'll get a copy of all of this later. But now I'd like to hand over to Miriam. Thank you.
So good morning, everyone. Can you hear me well? Yes, okay. So I'm going to address a topic that is still quite controversial, because while the health benefits of plant-based diets for adults are widely accepted, there is still this idea that these diets may lead to malnutrition and poor growth in children. However, these concerns are not really based on facts, on scientific data. We are going to look today at recent research on European children raised on vegan diets. I'm going to summarize the main results from 3 cohorts of children of different ages living in Germany and Poland. And these studies have been published in the last 5 years. I have listed them here in case you want to look at them in more detail later. So let's start with growth. So this first study looked at the growth of vegan kids, young vegan kids, 1 to 3 years. You can see here the weight for height, and here the height for age. And you can see that the majority of children, they were classified in 3 groups: ovo-lacto-vegetarian, vegan, and conventional diets. And you can see that the vast majority of them were growing as expected. The height and the weight were within normal range. The children on non-vegetarian diets were slightly more prone to have overweight and obesity. And in the vegan group, in the middle column, you can see a small percentage of children who had their weights and heights slightly below the normal range. But in general, most of the children, regardless of their diet, were growing well at this young age. If we look at another group, older group of children, in this case from Poland, in this case they look at they measure the standard deviation for different measurements, and they found, by the way, in this table and the next ones, you are going to see different numbers in different colors. So blue colors means that there were no significant difference between the groups. When the color is green, that means that there was a significant difference, and the vegan group was doing better for that outcome, for that finding. And when the number is in red, that means that the non-vegetarian group was doing better for that outcome or for that finding. So what they found was all the children in this study, vegetarians, non-vegetarians and vegans, were growing within normal range. The non-vegetarian children, they were a little taller and heavier than the vegan kids, but all of them were within normal range. This is what we know about growth. What if we look at nutritional intake? Let's look again at the younger group of children, 1 to 3 years. So they compare nutritional intake, and they see that for the same caloric intake, the same number of calories, or very similar, the vegan group was having a macronutrient intake that was closer to the official recommendation. So a more appropriate number of, both groups were having more protein than recommended, so they were exceeding the normal, the minimum intake, but the vegan children were having less fat, more complex carbohydrates, less sugars, and more fiber compared to the other group. If we look at the micronutrients, and this is the vitamins, they were eating similar amounts of vitamin A, but the vegan children were having much more amounts of vitamins for most of them, but were having less vitamin B2. That was the only thing, and of course B12, but I'm not considering it here because most of the children were taking supplements, and I assume all children in Europe should be taking B12 vitamins. But this was the only vitamin that was lower in vegan children. And in fact, there was a significant number of children in this group that were not reaching the recommended amounts. For minerals, they found similar amounts of zinc, but the vegan group was having more magnesium and iron, and less iodine and selenium, and again calcium. So the researchers then look at how many children in each group, what was the percentage of children who were not reaching the recommended amounts. So in this line, you can see this is the 100%, this is the recommended daily requirements amounts, and the green box is the vegan group and the red box is the non-vegetarian group. So you can see for vitamin B2, most children, all the children or most children in the non-vegetarian group were reaching or exceeding the recommended amounts, but there was a significant number of vegan children who did not. For vitamin D, you can see that both groups were well below the recommended amounts, and it was not very significantly different between both groups. On the other hand, for vitamin E, most children, or almost all children in the vegan group, were meeting or exceeding the recommended amounts, but there was a significant number of non-vegetarian children who were not reaching the recommended amounts. Remember that this vitamin is a powerful antioxidant. If we look at minerals, they found a significant number of vegan children not reaching the 100% recommended amounts, and this number in the non-vegetarian group was much lower, so most of them were meeting these requirements. Iodine and selenium were a problem for both groups because none of the groups for iodine was reaching or were reaching the recommended amounts, but the vegan group was doing a little worse. And for selenium, the variability was wider, and so there were some children in the vegan group who were taking quite a lot, probably from Brazil nuts, but it was a problem again even for some non-vegan children as well. So if we look at now at an older group of children from Germany as well, 6 to 18 years of age, in this other study, the first thing they look at was at what food groups were the children eating. And you can see that the amount of fruit was quite similar, even if it appears like higher in this group, but there was no statistical difference between both. But the vegan kids were eating more vegetables, more grains, and especially whole grains, more legumes and nuts. And in fact, I was shocked to see, this number shouldn't be right, sorry. I was shocked to see 0 here. This is the average intake of non-vegetarian children in Europe. And then less sugars, less added sugars, and less added oils and fats. So I was so worried about this that I wanted to look at what the non-vegetarian children in this study were really eating. And what I found from the study was that most of them were eating too much meat, were exceeding the maximum recommended amount from the official recommendations and from the recent Lancet guidelines. They were not taking enough grains and very, very little whole grains, which is worrying. Virtually no legumes, no nuts and seeds, which is worrying as well, and too much sugar. And it's important to take this into account because this is considered the gold standard diet for children, right? When we compare vegan children with the omnivorous children, it's because we think that they are eating a complete diet, but when we look at more detail, that is not the case in many cases. So this is a direct quote from the authors of this study, and they said that the vegan children and adolescents showed healthier food intake pattern with highest intakes of vegetables, whole grains, legumes, and nuts, and the lowest intakes of sweets and snack foods. So this is not surprising when we look at the nutritional intake based on the food group distribution, that even with similar amounts of calories in both groups, the vegan children had macronutrient intakes that were closer to the official recommendation. They were taking a more appropriate number of protein or amount of protein, less fat, less saturated fat, half of it, more complex carbohydrates, less sugars, and more fiber. So all the numbers were favorable to the vegan group. If we look at vitamins, there were similar amounts of vitamin A, but again, it's very similar to the younger group, more vitamins E, C, folate, and B1, and less vitamins B2 and B12. In this study, because the children were older, the researchers also took blood samples and measured some biomarkers, nutritional biomarkers, and also markers of cardiovascular health that we are going to look at. And for example, this is the levels of vitamin B2 in blood, and they look at the percentage of children who had low levels in blood, lower than the limits. And they found that 1 out of 2 vegan children and 1 out of 3 of non-vegan children had lower levels in blood, which is something that we should be paying more attention. So it was a problem for both groups, but more so for the vegans. So here is the minerals, and again, similar amounts of zinc, higher index of iron and magnesium in the vegan group, and again, lower index of calcium. And if we look at the blood biomarkers, and we are going to look at it in more detail, just only look at this, that the values, the hemoglobin values were very, very similar. But look at the cardiovascular risk factors at this young age. So the vegan children had lower values of total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol. And this is showing the number of children in each group with abnormal values, and we are going to look in more detail now. But look at this. So the non-vegetarian group at this age were already having abnormal levels of cholesterol and LDL cholesterol. So here, this is to show you that even so the vegan children had a slightly higher proportion of low iron stores, but the number in both groups was very low, was around 10-12%, 8% here and 11-12% here, so very low. And the number of children with low hemoglobin levels were very, very low in both groups, which is very reassuring. And it was practically identical in both groups. And if we look at low vitamin D in blood, almost 1 out of 3 of both groups, vegan and non-vegans, were having low levels, which is something of concern as well. So now we are going to look at the other study, the Poland study. So these children were, the Polish study, these children were a little younger, 5 to 10 years, and they did a very similar study, and we are going to see a very, very similar dietary pattern compared to the other groups, which is good because the results are becoming very consistent. So again, very similar levels of calorie intake, but less fat, less saturated fat. Look at the numbers here, like less than half of it. More fiber, like double amount of fiber. In this case, more vitamin A, and also more, folate and iron. And again, the same finding, less calcium than the non-vegetarian children. Again, something that we have to keep an eye on that. They also look at blood samples and some biomarkers as well. And again, if you look at the cardiovascular markers, look at the total cholesterol and the number of children with high LDL, which is the bad cholesterol levels, were significantly different, even at this young age, which is something of concern. We are going to look at this. The number of children in the vegan group with lower iron stores and lower hemoglobin level was slightly higher, but still low. And this is very interesting, at least for me, because I hadn't seen this before. They also measured the C-reactive protein, which is a marker of inflammation, and the levels in the vegan group were significantly lower, again at this young age. So this is, again, something to look at. This study, they also look at the bone mineral density, and I think it's for the first time that it has been looked at children. We know we have a lot of data now in adults, but not in children, and they found significant difference in non-vegetarian children compared to vegan. They had better values, and because this is the first study, we don't have more data, we need to be a little cautious about this, but it's important to keep an eye on this. We don't know because remember, these non-vegetarian children from Poland were slightly taller and heavier than the vegan group, so perhaps they were just growing faster and reaching puberty a little faster, and they were accumulating or making a bone faster, but it's important because remember that this can be related with the lower calcium intake and with the generally low vitamin D intake. So it's something that we should be looking at in more details in future studies. So in summary, from these recent studies, these are in Germany and Poland. From my clinical experience, I was not surprised to read these studies because I'm seeing the same patterns in the UK and in Spain and in other countries in Europe. We have seen that European vegan children are growing within the normal range for the reference population, but they tend to be leaner than the non-vegetarian group. We have seen that the dietary pattern in European vegan children at all ages, from 1 year to the end of the adolescence, is closer to the official recommendations. Macronutrient intakes are more in line with official recommendations. European vegan children are consuming more of the most vitamins, including antioxidants, and similar amounts of vitamin A and zinc. And the main problem with this group of children is that they are consuming less vitamin B2, and a significant number of them are not meeting official recommendations. We also have seen that iodine and selenium are nutrients of concern for all children in Europe, but this is slightly more marked for the vegan group. We have seen that consistently calcium intake is low in the vegan group, and a good number of them are not meeting the recommendations, and this is of concern. Vitamin D intake is low in all European children. We don't know how much they are getting from sunlight, but from the blood samples, the number of children with vitamin D deficient is quite alarming. And we have also seen, just from one study, but it's important and is something that we need to look at later, is that the European vegan children appear to have lower bone density than non-vegetarian children. We also have seen that even if vegan children have slightly lower iron stores, the hemoglobin values are quite similar, and the number of children with anemia in European children is very, very low, so this is very reassuring. And we also know that lower iron stores are possibly protective in the long term, so that is not of concern at all. And vegan children consistently are showing in the studies that even at a very young age have better markers of cardiovascular health. So in response to the question that can plant-based diet support a healthy childhood, I think we can say, based on recent studies and well-done studies with a large group of children in each group, and studies well done, that yes, they can support healthy growth, growth and health, and actually are much healthier in many aspects than the non-vegetarian diets. Of course, there are some aspects that should be optimized, and we are going to talk about this now. But I think the general message from these recent studies is quite positive for the vegan children population. So thank you very much for your attention.
I can get this to work. Okay, so my name's Ailsa McHardy. I am a paediatric dietitian. And what I really hope to do today, following on from the evidence that Miriam has presented, is just think about in terms of practice as dietitians and as other healthcare professionals. What does that actually mean for our practice? How do we take all this new evidence and new data that we have, and does that change anything about what we do, and what should it change? So just a couple of conflicts of interest. I'm the founder of Nourish RD, which is my freelance dietetic practice, and I'm also academic staff at the Robert Gordon University in Aberdeen, where I teach on the MDiet undergraduate master's programme. So a really brief bit about me. So I've been a registered dietitian for 13 years. Around 10 of those were spent in the NHS, and I've done paediatrics for 9 years, 3 of which have been predominantly in the freelance field. I've had a specific interest in plant-based nutrition over the past 4 years, which really kind of came about when I had children of my own, and that I think encouraged me to think more deeply about the ethics and the morals around what we eat, as well as, of course, the health aspects, and how I wanted to bring up my family. So yeah, I work as a freelance dietitian, and I see lots of different children, lots of different types of families in my freelance practice, but certainly including vegan and plant-based families. And what I really hope to bring today are just some insights from practice, some context and some practical approaches in terms of how we can work effectively with families of young children. So what I'm going to do as a sort of spine for this is just think about the way in which I assess a patient when I see a child in clinic. What's the information I'm looking for? What's the advice that I'm trying to give? So this is just one of the history sheets that I would use. And what I wanted to do is just think about where on this would recent data, recent evidence change or make me think differently about how I was assessing a child. So I'm going to do that in terms of assessment of growth, assessment of nutritional intake, and also care planning, so the advice that I might give in terms of food and supplements. So we'll come first to the assessment of growth. So I've copied here some of the information that Miriam presented. So these are just some of the same tables and graphs that were within her presentation. And if we think first about height growth, so should we be more concerned about height growth in children, and how should we translate that into the way that we assess and monitor our patients and the families that we work with? So we know that there's perhaps some concern that vegan and plant-based children have got lower height attainment or are growing slightly more slowly than non-vegan and non-vegetarian counterparts. I think that the significance of that is definitely very debatable, and is it actually in any way favourable that children grow to be very tall very quickly? Is that a good thing? I think, you know, we certainly don't really have any evidence that would say that what we want is very tall children. But I think what the evidence does perhaps indicate is just that we want to be monitoring height in children, just really as we would in any others. But also really important, and this is really a kind of insight that I think I have from practice, is the importance of contextualizing a child's length, height, and growth in general to the family that is sat in front of you. So I can think of so many people that I've met in clinic, and whether they're following a plant-based diet or not, or bringing their child up in that dietary pattern, where they're really concerned because people are saying to them, your child's so small, or parents make comments, or they look at other children in the nursery class or in the playground at school and say, oh, but she's so small. And I think we aren't very good always at contextualizing a child's growth to them and to the parents and to that family. So it's a really simple thing, but using the mid-parental height centile, so basically where we can look at what's mum's height, what's dad's height, what might we expect this child's growth to look like, is actually really helpful and extremely reassuring most of the time for parents that I see in clinic. So they might not be growing on the 75th centile for height, but if they've got a father who follows this, the second centile for height, or did at the age of 18, and a mum that was on the 25th centile, why would we expect that child to be on the 75th or 91st centile for height? So that can be really reassuring. So in terms of what the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health recommend for growth, so that on the left is just what their recommendations are about when we should monitor. So there's no set standards for plant-based or vegan children. Decisions should always be made clinically. And more frequent length or height monitoring might be indicated, but always should be considered on an individual basis. Again, really important to consider that the measuring of length and height, anyone who's done this in practice on a baby or a young child will know that it can be really difficult. It can be really difficult to do practically, to do it accurately. And I have frequently found myself in clinic trying to length measure a baby, and they're screaming, and you're thinking, this isn't that scary, like it's not sore, you're just lying being measured, but it's often really difficult. So it's tricky to do it at times. And really important to consider the potential for causing parental anxiety. And actually in practice, when parents are asking me about, oh, I weigh them every week, or I measure them every week, or whatever, often what I would say is stop doing that, stop weighing them so much, stop measuring them so much, give them months and then check their height again. And that's because of the difficulty in doing it accurately, but also the potential for causing parental anxiety. So I think it's always really important to think about, what am I going to do with that information? People will know that as clinicians, that before you do any kind of investigation, you'll be thinking, what's that going to add to the picture? What is that going to be useful to me? So I would say that that's really important, particularly with height. And in terms of weight, so very much the same. And I think when we look at the data, you can see that if anything, the overall thing that you would see is that in vegan and vegetarian children, the risk of overweight and obesity is much smaller, which is a huge positive. But there is this slight increased risk or chance perhaps of low weight or of malnutrition. So again, making decisions clinically, more frequent weight monitoring might be indicated on an individual basis, and I would say that's okay to do a bit more regularly, but even really in any situation apart from perhaps a very specific neonatal situation, I would say once a month is the maximum frequency that I would want that to be being done. And I think also offering context to parents and discussing the shift in societal norms and what we now expect to see. So again, a lot of parents will say they're so skinny compared to their classmates, or people always say that she's so thin or that he's so small or whatever. And it's really important just to have that discussion with parents about what we now see, what do our eyes expect to see in terms of weight and growth. And I think that's really important, and I quite often have just nice sort of hopefully reassuring discussions with parents in clinic about that, and actually it's about how your child is growing for them, not about how they compare to the rest of society. But always with both, just being aware, as you would with any child on any dietary pattern, of the potential for inadequate nutritional intakes affecting their weight. So that's how recent evidence would change or would influence my assessment of growth. So I'm now going to come on to looking at assessment of intake and care planning. So if we think first about macronutrients, so I'm going to kind of divide this up into macronutrients and then some specific micronutrients. But in both the studies that Miriam presented on, we can see really clearly that intake of macronutrients among vegan children was demonstrated to meet or exceed estimated requirements. That doesn't mean that on individual level and in individual cases that children might not be having, they may well be having inadequate intakes of protein or carbohydrate or fat. But the assumption that vegan children generally have intakes that are inadequate in macronutrients, is really not evidenced by the data. So this is just further evidence to that we don't need to make any assumption that a child that's on a vegan or plant-based diet is therefore not having enough protein, because actually the evidence doesn't tell us that at all. So I'm then going to move on, and I'm kind of just going to focus specifically on these 4 micronutrients, which I think are the key ones where there's perhaps some need for specific consideration, and not only in vegan and plant-based children, again, as the data has shown, but for specific nutrients in all children. And I think this is just a reminder that, I hear so much and get asked so many questions about how do plant-based children get this and how do they get that? And I think, well, hang on, where do any children get that? And we need to be thinking broadly about all children and not just assuming that because a child is vegan that this is therefore a problem. So just to sidestep quickly to the National Diet and Nutrition Survey, so I'm sure people will be aware of this, but it is a rolling, continuous, cross-sectional survey in the UK, which has been conducted since 2008. So looking at a representative sample of 1,000 people per year. And it's really used to identify nutritional issues in the population, and it monitors what are people's intakes, what do our diets actually look like. So we know a lot about the Eat Well guide and what should our diets look like. But what the NDNS data tells us is what do they actually look like? So what are people actually eating? And it's a really interesting data set that's available and free to access. But it doesn't differentiate between dietary patterns. So the data that I've got here is based on the representative sample, which is in terms of all population groups. So I'm not going to read through this in detail, but what I've done is looked at the 4 key micronutrients that we're going to be thinking about in terms of vegan and plant-based children, and looked at what are intakes of those nutrients like in the UK population as a whole based on the NDNS data, and what are the key dietary sources of them. So for all of them, for calcium, for riboflavin, vitamin B2, for iodine and for selenium, there's risk of low intakes, and there's a certain proportion who are not having adequate amounts in general across the board, regardless of dietary pattern. And it also highlights that we need probably to be kind of specifically concerned about teenage girls. So they seem to be at the highest risk of inadequate intakes, regardless of what dietary pattern they're having. So we maybe need a bit more focus on them. And then in terms of the key dietary sources, I think what that really highlights is that cereal and cereal products and milk products currently in the UK make up a very significant amount of our intakes of these nutrients. So what I've got, I should have said at the beginning, throughout my slides, I've just put in little excerpts from some information sheets, fact sheets, and resources that might be helpful. So you can, if you want to find them and look for further information, then that's where they've come from. So in terms of calcium, I think based on the data that we have, that we have to date, it's prudent to optimize intake, so for it to be something that we consider. But estimated requirements can generally be met very easily by the diet if we give that some consideration. So I would always ask families about what plant-based milk they're using. Is it a fortified option? Are they using one? And is it a fortified option? And always considering that organic products generally at the moment are not fortified. Fortified breads and cereals can also be really useful, and I think it's important that we think about the concern that parents might have around the use of processed and ultra-processed food. Obviously, things like fortified bread and cereals will be processed foods. But I think it's always important to think about context. And if that is making up a small part of the child's overall diet, then I would be very encouraging of that in terms of making sure that we're meeting micronutrient requirements. And in terms of calcium, so supplements, I would say are unlikely to be necessary. It's not something I would be saying all children on a plant-based diet should be having a calcium supplement, but we should assess that individually. So for some children, it might be appropriate. So in terms of riboflavin, so vitamin B2, so we don't have broad UK consensus on specific requirements for this, but the US RDAs can be a helpful guide. Again, with B2, it's really prudent, I think, to optimize intake. We've seen that it might be a nutrient of concern for plant-based children and for all children. Again, we can likely meet requirements with diet and some very simple ways in which we can do this. Again, fortified plant-based milk, fortified breakfast cereals, and that doesn't need to be really sugary sweetened ones. There's lots of much less processed ones with fewer ingredients that are still fortified. And nutritional yeast as well is an excellent source of vitamin B2. And is very easy to add to the diet of a child at all stages. So it works really well with lots of different textures, so even from weaning in soft foods, pureed foods, and it can be used in many things. Again, I would always consider the need for supplementation individually. So if I had a child that was on a very restricted diet or didn't include any of the kind of good sources of riboflavin frequently in the diet, then maybe I would be thinking about a supplement. So in terms of iodine then, I think this is one where there's a bit more, we're probably more used to hearing about the concern around iodine. At the moment, the majority of dietary intake in UK children comes from non-vegan sources, and I think when we kind of pair this with the evidence we've seen about inadequate iodine intakes and status in children, it's prudent that we really give this plenty of consideration. So even with optimised plant-based intakes, it is difficult to meet estimated requirements. So you would need to be consuming large amounts of iodine-fortified plant-based milk and plant-based yogurt to be able to meet these requirements. And I think something that we have to take into consideration is the cost of that. And you know, I will work with families where children are drinking, you know, maybe 600 mils of a fortified plant-based milk a day, but the cost of doing that, if you're choosing a really well-fortified option, isn't insignificant. So we have to take all those things into account, and we want good diets and plant-based diets to be accessible to everyone, and we don't want to kind of price people out feeling that they're able to do that. So I would say for iodine, supplementation is likely to be necessary in children. It's one that I would generally always, if I can use that phrase, be recommending. And finally, selenium. So the diet can provide recommended intakes of selenium quite easily, but just requires the use of some quite specific foods. So I know that these have been mentioned previously. But I would be encouraging Brazil nuts and lentils regularly in the diet of children. So if not daily, then a few times a week at least. But really important that we consider the presentation of that. How do you feed? So it's great for me to think, I know Brazil nuts are really good. They've got lots of selenium in them. I'm going to eat a few of them each day. But try telling that to a 3-year-old, or how do you present that to a 3-year-old? In what form do you give that to them? So thinking about that kind of thing. Ground nuts and blended nuts and nut butters and that kind of thing can be really helpful. But certainly also considering a selenium supplement if the diet is limited, or if, like most children of a young age, they are picky and unpredictable in terms of what they eat, because that's kind of normal and what you would expect for a child. So to summarize the kind of care planning in terms of the diet that I would be suggesting, so I would encourage families to aim to include Brazil nuts and lentils at least weekly in their child's diet. I would be encouraging them to ensure that plant-based milk and yogurt alternatives are fortified, non-organic options. I would encourage the daily and regular use of fortified cereal products, and that doesn't need to be bowls of cereal necessarily as a breakfast option, but using things like fortified oats in pancakes or doing some baking. So the things at the top are some cereal bars that I quite often make with my little ones. Adding sprinkles if needed to get them to want to eat things, that's totally fine. And giving parents lots of reassurance and context, I think, is key. And that would be the one thing, I think, if there was one thing that I would want people to kind of take home from what I've presented, it would be that giving them reassurance and context is really important. So parents can often get hyper-focused on individual nutrients. And I quite often meet parents who are frantically worried about where is their child getting enough of this specific nutrient from. So we don't eat nutrients, we eat diets, and children are the same. And I think it's, I often find it for context quite helpful to remind them of the terribly low intake of fruit and vegetables and fibre in general in the UK, and say your child's already way beyond that. So let's just look at how we can continue to kind of improve things a little bit further. In terms of supplementation, so review of the latest evidence, I think it suggests it's prudent to supplement with iodine generally always, so there would be very few circumstances where a young child wouldn't be advised to take an iodine supplement. The only kind of caveats would be if they were having particularly large intakes of iodine-fortified foods. And to consider calcium, selenium and riboflavin on an individual level. And that would always be in addition to the general advice to supplement with B12, supplement with vitamin D, and to supplement with an EPA, DHA supplement as well. So it always needs context, it always needs consideration of what's actually relevant for this child. And exactly as has been mentioned earlier, not just blanket supplementing with things without really considering what do they need and why. And just on a really practical level, these are some of the supplements that I would generally recommend, or things that I find quite useful to recommend. So the Veg one from the Vegan Society, either the adult version, which is suitable for older children as well, or the baby and toddler liquid multivitamin. And the Nutrigen Vitamix in sprinkles are really helpful. They come in a very kind of undetectable format, so they're good for fussier eaters or more selective eaters, and they have a really broad range of micronutrients in them, so that's really good where the diet's quite limited. And also the Boots have options, and there's lots of other products as well. So really important to consider the cost, what's actually reasonable for this family. The tolerance, I often say, you know, you can have the best supplements in the world, but if they're sat in the cupboard and nobody's taking them, then they're not doing any good. And I think anyone who has tried to get a 3-year-old to put their socks on will understand that if they don't want to take a supplement, they're not going to take it. So that's really important. So if they actually would prefer something that was a chewable thing that looked like Peppa Pig and tasted like a sweetie, and that's what they'll take, then that's better than any other option sat in the cupboard. So giving lots of context around that. And to finish, these are just some useful resources that I think probably have been signposted to before, but the Plant-Based Health Professionals Kids Zone is brilliant. It's got loads of stuff that you can download and is really accessible in its format. The British Dietetic Association has also got lots of downloadable food fact sheets, so focusing on specific nutrients, and again, really easy to access for anyone and to download for yourselves or for patients as needed. And the book Nourish by Reshma Shah and Brenda Davis. So this is just something that personally I found really helpful in terms of answering some of the more nuanced things around bringing up children on predominantly plant-based diets and how to navigate certain situations with empathy, but also understanding and bearing in mind that children are still just children, regardless of what diet they follow. They're still just children and they're nightmares at times. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So just a reminder about Slido. Hopefully you've all managed to download that from your app store, or you can also access that online. But just a reminder that the code is 8893517. But we're going to be using it all weekend and all the talks, so it's a great way to see what other people are asking and also to ask your burning questions as well, so we can have a nice interactive discussion. You can upvote other people's questions as well if you really like that question and you want it to be asked. But yes, let's kick off because we've got a lot of questions and we've got about 15 minutes. So the first question is, what brands of unsweetened fortified soy milk would you recommend for children? Alpro Growing Up milk is so sweet and organic is unfortified.
I think this question is probably for me. Is this switched on?
Have
got this switched on?
It should be on. Mine was on automatically, is it?
Okay, hopefully it's on then. Can people hear? Yeah, okay.
It's a bit quiet.
You might have to remind me of the question. There were a few little
So
bits.
which is
So unsweetened fortified soya milk.
exactly?
So the Alpro one is good. I think the other thing that's always really good to consider, and I would always be considering in practice patients' budgets. And therefore it might not be that for an individual family that's spending an extra £1.50 on something that makes up a relatively small part of the diet is worth it compared to the money that what they could spend that other money on, what other foods they could spend that money on. But I would say, so the Alpro fortified unsweetened version is a good one, and lots of supermarket own brand products are actually very good as well. So all the supermarkets in the UK, all the big supermarkets have their own brand versions. And I would also always encourage people to look at the shelf in the supermarket as well as the fridge. So quite often UHT versions are nutritionally just as good, but much easier to store and much easier to buy in large quantities when they're on special offers. So that, yeah, I would look at the Alpro unsweetened one or the supermarket own brand ones and look at the UHT section in the supermarket as well.
Super. I would also want to add that we actually have a whole guide that was written by Miriam on the Plant-Based Health Professionals website. If you look up Plant-Based Health Professionals, the kids section, we have a whole section on plant-based milks for infants and for children that looks at different types of milks and you know, the nutrients to look out for from 0 to 6 months, 6 to 12 months, and so on. So do have a look at that. This question is for Miriam. Could you explain why micronutrients have a lower intake in girls? So the recommendations for micronutrient intakes, why, I think it was about the recommendations for micronutrients.
It's about, it's about recommendations or about intake?
Yeah, it was about intake.
I think the difference during childhood is minimal for many micronutrients. It becomes more significantly different when during puberty, because especially for iron and other nutrients for girls do need more. But I think from 3 to 10 years are quite similar, if I'm not.
And how about the intakes? Do they match up with that?
Probably because girls are taking less calories, so it's just a matter of how much quantity they need. But I haven't seen that this is significantly different for many nutrients. Really.
Fantastic. So this question was about, the top most voted question was about plant-based milks, which have recently been in the press a lot about, being labeled as ultra-processed. And they are technically an ultra-processed food, according to what the definition is. And someone has mentioned the glucose spikes and their impact on metabolic health. So again, as Ailsa so beautifully said, we consume foods, not nutrients, and we have to look at the totality of the dietary pattern. It's not a single food or a single meal that's going to make or break our health. When we're having things like oat milk, we're generally not having a whole cup on its own. We're tending to have it maybe with porridge, with berries, with flax. So you've got to look at it in that context as well. But I would say that, yes, if you are worried about that, go for the unsweetened, fortified versions. Now, sometimes plant milks do have a little bit of added oil. There's been a lot of fear-mongering around seed oils and things. This makes a very small percentage of the total calorie intake of the milks, and it's used to really help them emulsify and to help them stay shelf stable, and also to help with the fortification of those nutrients that we talked about, the calcium, the vitamin D, B12, which are such important nutrients for everyone, but especially, if you're on a plant-based diet. So I think if you're going for those unsweetened, the brands that are, unfortified, then you need to be sure that you're getting your nutrients from other sources. I also think the obsession with or the focus on being natural can detract from what is actually the healthiest for us to enable us to thrive. Sometimes we fixate on, this is processed, but we know that so-called processed foods, minimally processed foods like tofu, can actually be hugely beneficial for our health. Things like canned beans have undergone processing, but they make it so much more convenient, affordable, and accessible to follow a plant-based diet. And certainly, as we've seen from Ailsa and Miriam, having unfortified plant milks is really not ideal in infancy and childhood, and I would argue at all stages of life. That's sort of the answer. If you've got issues with insulin resistance, blood sugar issues, maybe avoid oat milk and go for things like unsweetened soya milk or pea milk. That's what I would suggest. But yeah, you tend to eat them as part of a meal, so glycemic index is less of an issue. Maybe if you're having it as a coffee, it's a bit different. Someone's asked, is there a vegan diet possible for children without supplements? So I'd like to ask Ailsa that.
Gosh. I would say at the moment that my answer to that would be generally no. So if I met a family and was assessing the diet that didn't involve any supplementation for a young child, would I be concerned? Yes, I probably would. I think we, by the nature in terms of, soil degradation and the way that the nutritional value of our fruits and vegetables and other plant foods has changed, I think it is at the moment what the evidence would say is that to support a healthy childhood and good growth in infancy and childhood is that there are certainly some key things that we do need to be supplementing with. So I think if I can give a really straightforward answer to that, then probably the answer is no. But I do think it's really important that we don't over-supplement. So I'm never keen to see people saying, well, we use this and we give them this and we give them these drops and this powder and this supplement and things just because we want to make sure. So I think it's really important that we say, well, what actually are the gaps at the moment? obviously we have to, with young children, like I said, regardless of what dietary pattern they follow, they're still just young children, and there's no reasoning with them a lot of the time. So you will have times where sometimes the dietary intake is great, sometimes it's not, and you might want a bit more of a safety net at that point. But I think it's really important that we supplement with what's needed, but don't supplement with things that aren't needed.
Wonderful.
Can I add something? Because some people tend to think that because vegan children need supplements, that vegan diet is not natural, but we forget that animal foods are already supplemented. So when they reach our table, we are having extra supplements because their feed is supplemented in a way that vegan foods are not. So the comparison is not fair. So we need to focus on what kind of vegan food is available for us now. Probably in the future, because there are a lot of research now in how we can make crops more nutritious and how can we increase the nutrition in soil, and this is probably something that is going to be very, very beneficial for everyone. But the animals people eat, are supplemented. So they are taking the supplements not directly, but this form. And vegans have to take them directly because we don't have sources right now, because still vegans are a very, very low proportion of the population. So there is not the concern of supplementing them. So don't think that because a vegan diet needs to be supplemented is less natural than a non-vegetarian one, because without supplementing the feed for the animals, it wouldn't be possible. Without supplementing the dairy products in the UK, people wouldn't have enough iodine. And so dairy products are supplemented with iodine. This is the main source now, but it's not natural as well. And can I say something about plant milks for children, especially for the young ones? I don't think we should stress or focus or worry too much about the amount of sugar. Remember that breast milk has 7% of sugar, and children eat a lot of calories at this young age. When the milk has enough amount of protein and fat, having like small amounts of sugar, like 2 grams per 100 ml, is not a problem. So it's not like we are adding a lot of sugar. So they take things in and for example, the Alpro growing up is not necessary for most families, but for some families who are worried because their child is not eating enough in this stage when they are refusing a lot of things, they give them a lot of reassurance. And it's not super sugary, it's just have some, and which is mimicking the breast milk that children at that age should be still drinking. So plant milks without sugar are more appropriate for us, for older children and adults, but don't worry too much about the young children if they have a small amount of sugar, because they need that, they need calories.
Totally agree. Yeah, there's some fantastic questions, and I do want to say if we can't get to all of them, please do come and find us, have a chat. There's a question about decaffeinated coffee and decaffeinated tea. Does that also stop the absorption of the nutrients I mentioned around things like iron? The answer is yes. It's not the caffeine that's the issue. It's the polyphenols, specifically tannins, that you find in things like tea, coffee, dark chocolate, red wine, that inhibit the absorption of those nutrients. So green tea is found to inhibit the absorption of iron by about 30%, black tea, even decaffeinated black tea, around 60%. So yeah, this is something to be really more aware of if you are already low in iron, and just be conscious of it, and maybe have your tea and coffee an hour or two outside of your meals. You don't need to completely give them up. And someone asked about iodine as well. There is iodized salt in other parts of the world, like the USA. We don't iodize our salt here. Usually just a small amount is enough of that iodized salt to just a quarter of a teaspoon or something like that to give you your iodine needs for the day. It's a micronutrient, so needs are small. But we do not recommend people increasing their salt consumption as well. So fine balance has to be struck. That's not an option here in the UK. This is a question for Ailsa. Is baby-led weaning onto a vegan diet safe?
So I think in terms of the way that we wean, that's so individual, and I think often it's, people maybe think that you need to choose between baby-led or spoon-fed, and I think I would generally say that isn't the case. So usually a combination of the two works really well. I wouldn't see that there was any reason in terms of baby-led compared to more spoon-feeding, weaning, why you couldn't do that on a plant-based diet. I think it's just really important that we're focusing on the right range of nutrients, that we're supplementing when needed, that we're using fortified products appropriately. I think in general, and this might sound a little bit controversial, and is probably quite based in my own opinion, but we often hear that we should be starting weaning with vegetable purees, with fruit purees and that kind of thing. And in a lot of instances, that's absolutely appropriate, and definitely it's really good to get an infant's palate used to a wide range of flavours as early on as possible, and particularly things like bitter flavours and more savoury flavours. But as Miriam just mentioned, babies are used to breast milk or formula milk, which is sweet. It's very sweet. If anyone's ever tasted a little bit of it themselves, then you'll know that. So if we go from that to then expecting them to eat really savoury or really bitter flavours, it might make sense that they're going to be like, I'm not eating that. Like, I've been used to drinking that delicious sweet milk for months and months, and now you want me to eat a pureed courgette or a pureed piece of kale or something, or to chew on that, and they'll go, I'm not going to do that. I wouldn't do it. So I think we need to think about that. And when we do plant-based weaning, it's really okay to encourage people that it doesn't have to be, it doesn't only have to be a stick of a bitter vegetable, and it's fine to give much more round and nourishing things alongside those new flavours. So thinking about where's the energy in this, where's the protein in this, and I think protein often, in terms of the way perhaps that we're given information about weaning traditionally, protein often gets a bit left behind, and it'll be you have to give all these different vegetables individually, and then you have to do all these different fruits individually and things. But making sure that you're giving, so really simple ways would be things like, if you're giving sticks of fruit or vegetables as a finger food, roll them in something like some ground nuts, or some fortified oat cereal, so things like ready break or ready oats and that kind of thing, spreading a bit of unsalted and unsweetened peanut butter or any other nut butter on like crackers or any kinds of other finger foods that children are eating. So thinking about that, looking at it and thinking, is that nourishing, as well as how are they actually going to be fed it? Are they going to feed it to themselves, or are they going to spoon feed it? But it doesn't need to be one or the other.
Great. There's a question about, do we recommend taking each supplement separately or as a multivitamin that combines them fine? So as I think we've all discussed, most of those nutrients are abundant in plant foods. We recommend a sort of food-first approach, getting lots of those fantastic plant foods in. But if you want to take a supplement, a multivitamin, multimineral supplement is fine. If you're really deficient in something like iron, just be aware that things like iron and calcium compete. So you don't want to be taking high doses of iron with a really calcium-rich meal, like but the issue is more with really high doses. With small amounts, it's okay. You don't need to worry too much. And taking nutrients like vitamin D with a meal that does contain some amount of fat is helpful, because those are vitamins A, D, E, and K are fat soluble. And for a lot of people, they don't want to be swallowing lots of pills. So, don't beat yourself up if you don't want to be taking all of those and remembering to do all of them. You have to work out what's convenient for you. And it can be difficult with children as well to do that. So we've got lots of information on vitamins and supplements. And lastly, there's so many questions about processing of foods here, things like Huel and things like that. And I think it's looking at the overall dietary pattern. If someone was having Huel 100% of the time, Huel, for those of you who don't know, it's like Soylent in the USA, which is a nutritionally complete meal replacement drink. And it was first sort of designed for people who were data scientists in Silicon Valley, coding all night and didn't have time to have breaks. And it's now become popular here. And I think it can be really helpful if you're running a busy NHS clinic and you regularly miss lunch, don't have time to eat anything, then that could be helpful. That it is is fortified with lots of vitamins and minerals. So you just want to be careful of doubling up on supplements and minerals if you're also taking things like protein powders or supplements. So be aware of that. And it's not going to suit everyone. Some people with things like IBS could have issues. Some people are sensitive to added sweeteners like sucralose that's found in Huel. So you've got to look at the overall dietary pattern. I wouldn't recommend having Huel over having meals that are rich in plant foods, but sometimes it's just not convenient or possible. So if you're traveling and going to a place which doesn't have many vegan options, you've got to take that into account and not demonize all processed foods. I think many of us can thrive on a plant-based diet by having some processed foods. I certainly do, and it makes food pleasurable and enjoyable, which we've talked about is really key from infancy to childhood to adulthood. So I think we're going to wrap up there. There's so many questions that were so brilliant we didn't get a chance to get to, but do come and chat to us. I think all of us are around all weekend. And thank you for coming. We've got a break now until 12 o'clock, and it's downstairs, and we're going to be having some snacks, tea and coffee. So please do make your way down there and have a chat with everyone. Thanks so much. And thank you. Thank you to our speakers. Dr. Miriam Martinez-Biarge, who's a fantastic pediatrician, and Ailsa McHardy, who's a fantastic pediatric dietitian. Ailsa also shares some fantastic information on social media, so do check them out. Thank you.
Thank you.